Bonapartism is a political ideology that was held by Napoleon Bonaparte, who inspired later forms of it. Initially, it referred to Napoleon and the French politicians who succeeded in the 18th Brumaire, ruling in the French consulate and subsequently in the First and Second French Empire under the House of Bonaparte. The political movement advocates the idea of a dictatorship or authoritarian centralized state, with a strongman charismatic leader based on anti-elitist rhetoric, army support, and conservatism. It is often defined as a political expression in the vocabulary of Marxism and Leninism, deriving from the career of Napoleon Bonaparte. Karl Marx was a student of Jacobinism and the French Revolution, as well as a contemporary critic of the Second Republic and Second Empire. The term Bonapartism is often used to refer to a situation in which counter-revolutionary military officers seize power from revolutionaries, and then use selective reformism to co-opt the radicalism of the popular classes. Marx argued that in the process Bonapartists preserve and mask the power of a narrower ruling class. Marx saw both Bonaparte and his nephew Napoleon III as having corrupted revolutions in France in this way. Marx offered this definition and analysis of Bonapartism in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, in 1852. In this document, he drew attention to what he calls the phenomenon's repetitive history, with one of his most well-known quotes: "History repeats itself, first as tragedy, then as farce." More generally, Bonapartism may be used to describe the replacement of civilian leadership by military leadership within revolutionary movements or governments. Many modern-day Trotskyists and other leftists use the phrase «left Bonapartist» to describe those like Stalin and Mao who controlled 20th-century bureaucratic socialist regimes. The term could just as easily apply to Leon Trotsky himself, since he was accused of using his position as commander of the Red Army to lever himself into power after Lenin's death. However, the complexity of Bonapartism is reflected in the literature of many notable political scientists and historians who themselves greatly differ on what its actual definition may be. Saadia Hazari Singh's widely revered book The Legend of Napoleon points out the plethora of interpretations regarding its usage. His own scholarship sees the term as reference to a popular national leader confirmed by popular election, above party politics, promoting equality, progress, and social change, with a belief in religion as an adjunct to the state, a belief that the central authority can transform society, and a belief in the nation and its glory, and a fundamental belief in national unity. Indeed, as Hazari Singh shows, the idea that Napoleon co-opted the revolution's principles and duped the masses runs contradictory to historical documents turned up in more recent research. It is difficult to believe that, even with those elements of forced conscription, thousands would have fought and fallen across Europe for a man without absolute certainty in his own conviction for those aforementioned principles. Hence, co-optation vis-a-vis Bonapartism exhibits the Marxist perspective of false consciousness, the idea that the masses can be manipulated by a few determined leaders in the pursuit of ends. Such dichotomies are rarely so clear-cut, however. To be sure, a comprehensive understanding of the term, whatever one's viewpoint, would be remiss without adequate study of its popular, liberal, and conservative facets. Raymond Hinnebusch, taking a conservative stance, has characterized Hafez al-Assad's regime in Syria as Bonapartist ideology. Philosophically, Bonapartism was the adaptation of principles of the French Revolution to suit Napoleon's imperial form of rule. Desires for public order and French national glory had combined to create a Cesarist coup d'état for General Bonaparte on 18 Brumaire. Though he espoused obeisance to revolutionary precedents, he himself styled his direct and personal rule on the old regime monarchs. For Bonapartists, the most significant lesson of the revolution was that unity of government and governed was paramount. The honeybee was a prominent political emblem for both the First and Second Empires, representing the Bonapartist ideal of devoted service, self-sacrifice and social loyalty. The defining characteristics of political Bonapartism, however, were flexibility and adaptability. Napoleon III once made a sardonic comment on a diversity of the members of his cabinet, united under the single banner of Bonapartism. Referring to the leading figures in the government of the Second Empire, he remarked, "The Empress is a legitimist, Morny is an all-Ayanist, Prince Napoleon is a Republican, and I myself am a socialist. There is only one Bonapartist, Persigny, and he is mad." Origins. In French political history, Bonapartists were monarchists who desired a French empire under the House of Bonaparte, the Corsican family of Napoleon Bonaparte and his nephew Louis. Bonapartism came about after Napoleon I was exiled to Elba. The Bonapartists helped him regain his power, leading to the 100 Days period. Some of his acolytes could not accept his defeat in 1815 at Waterloo or the Congress of Vienna and continued to push the Bonaparte ideology forward. Napoleon I's death in exile on St. Helena in 1821 only transferred the allegiance of many of these persons to other members of his family, however, particularly after the death of Napoleon's son, the Duke of Reichstadt. There were several different members of the family on whom the Bonapartist hopes rested. The disturbances of 1848 gave the nascent political undercurrent hope. Bonapartism, as an ideology of politically neutral French peasants and workers, was essential in the election of Napoleon I's nephew Louis Napoleon Bonaparte as President of the Second Republic, and gave him the political support necessary for his 1852 discarding of the Constitution and proclaiming the Second Empire. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte assumed the title Napoleon III to acknowledge the brief reign of Napoleon's son Napoleon II at the end of the 100 Days. In 1815. In 1870, the French National Assembly forced Napoleon III to sign a declaration of war that led France to a disastrous defeat at the hands of Prussia in the Franco-Prussian War. The Emperor surrendered himself to the Prussians and the German allies to avoid further bloodshed at the Battle of Sedan, and went into exile after a parliamentary coup created the Third Republic. Afterwards, Bonapartists continued to aspire and to agitate for another member of the family to be placed on the throne. However, from 1871 forward, they competed with monarchist groups that favored the restoration of the family of Louis-Philippe, King of the French, and with those who favored the restoration of the House of Bourbon, the traditional French royal family. The strength of these three factions combined was almost undoubtedly greater than that of the Republicans of the era. But as the three proved to be irreconcilable on the choice of who should be the new French monarch, monarchist fervor eventually waned and the French Republic became more or less a permanent facet of French life. Bonapartism was slowly relegated to being the civic faith of a few romantics as more of a hobby than a practical political philosophy. The death knell for Bonapartism was probably sounded when Eugene Bonaparte, the only son of Napoleon III, was killed in action while serving as a British Army officer in Zululand in 1879. Thereafter Bonapartism ceased to be a significant political force. There are no remaining descendants in male line from any other of Napoleon's brothers, and no serious political movement that aims to restore any of these men to the imperial throne of France. Bonapartist claimants. The law of succession Napoleon I established on becoming emperor in 1804 provided that the Bonapartist claim to the throne should pass firstly to Napoleon's own legitimate male descendants through the male line. At that time he had no legitimate sons, and it seemed unlikely he would have any due to the age of his wife Josephine. His eventual response was the unacceptable one, in Catholic eyes, of engineering a dubious annulment, without papal approval, of his marriage to Josephine and undertaking a second marriage to the younger Marie-Louise, with whom he had one son. The law of succession provided that if Napoleon's own direct line died out, the claim passed first to his older brother Joseph and his legitimate male descendants through the male line, then to his younger brother Louis and his legitimate male descendants through the male line. His other brothers, Lucien and Jerome, and their descendants, were omitted from the succession because they had either politically opposed the emperor or made marriages of which he disapproved. By Marie-Louise, Napoleon had one son, in whose favor he abdicated after his final defeat in 1815. Although the Bonapartes were now deposed and the old Bourbon monarchy restored, Bonapartists recognized this child as Napoleon II. However, he was sickly, virtually imprisoned in Austria, and died young and unmarried, without leaving any further direct descendants of Napoleon I. When the Bonaparte Empire was restored to power in France in 1852, the emperor was Napoleon III, Louis Bonaparte's only living legitimate son. In 1852, Napoleon III, having restored the Bonaparte to power in France, enacted a new decree on the succession. The claim first went to his own male legitimate descendants in the male line. If his own line died out, the new decree allowed the claim to pass to Jerome, Napoleon's youngest brother who had previously been excluded, and his male descendants by Princess Katharina of Württemberg in the male line. The only remaining Bonapartist claimants since 1879, and today, have been the descendants of Jerome and Catherine of Württemberg in the male line. In their willingness to ignore primogeniture and the cavalier approach to the Catholic belief in the indissolubility of marriage and to the Pope's right as final arbiter on the validity of marriages, the Bonapartist laws of succession were far from traditional, but then, the whole claim of the Bonaparte family to rule France was far from traditional. Bonapartist, as a communist epithet, Bonapartism is often defined as a political expression in the vocabulary of Marxism and Leninism, deriving from the career of Louis Bonaparte. Karl Marx was a student of Jacobinism and the French Revolution as well as a contemporary critic of the Second Republic and Second Empire. He used the term Bonapartism to refer to a situation in which counter-revolutionary military officers seize power from revolutionaries, and then use selective reformism to co-opt the radicalism of the popular classes. In the process, Marx argued, Bonapartists preserve and mask the power of a narrower ruling class. He saw Napoleon I and Napoleon III as having both corrupted revolutions in France in this way. Marx offered this definition of an analysis of Bonapartism in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, written in 1852. In this document, he drew attention to what he calls the phenomenon's repetitive history with one of his most quoted lines, typically condensed aphoristically as, "History repeats itself, first as tragedy, then as farce." A Bonapartist regime for Marx appears to have great power, but only because there is no class with enough confidence or power to firmly establish its authority in its own name. So a leader who appears to stand above the struggle can take the mantle of power. It is an inherently unstable situation where the apparently all-powerful leader is swept aside once the struggle is resolved one way or the other. The term was used by Leon Trotsky to refer to Joseph Stalin's regime, which Trotsky believed was balanced between the proletariat, victorious but shattered by war, and the bourgeoisie, broken by the revolution but struggling to re-emerge. However, the failure of Stalin's regime to disintegrate under the shock of the Second World War, and indeed its expansion into Eastern Europe, challenged this analysis. Many Trotskyists thus rejected the idea that Stalin's regime was Bonapartist, and some went further, notably Tony Cliff, who described such regimes as state capitalist and not deformed worker states at all. In the last year of his life, Trotsky responded to these elements with the example of Napoleon's expanding empire, which brought about the abolition of serfdom in Poland and other French holdings. yet was still unarguably Bonapartist. More generally, Bonapartism may be used to describe the replacement of civilian leadership by military leadership within revolutionary movements or governments. Some modern-day Trotskyists and others on the left use the phrase left Bonapartist to describe those like Stalin and Mao Zedong who controlled left-wing or populist totalitarian regimes. Hence, co-optation vis-a-vis Bonapartism exhibits the Marxist perspective of false consciousness, the idea that the masses can be manipulated by a few determined leaders in the pursuit of ends. Such dichotomies are rarely so clear-cut, however. Bonapartism in the French political spectrum. According to historian René Raymond's famous 1954 book, Les Droites en France, Bonapartism constitutes one of the three French right-wing families, the latest one after far-right legitimism and centre-right Orléanism. Both Boulangisme and Gaullism would be forms of Bonapartism. However, Bonapartists have consistently disagreed with this classification, as one of the fundamentals of Bonapartism as an ideology is the refusal to adhere to the left-right divide, which they see as an obstacle to the welfare and unity of the nation. Martin S. Alexander, in his book, French History Since Napoleon, notes that Bonapartism as an idea would not have made a significant impact if it had been either classifiable as left-wing or as right-wing. The historian Jean Sainz in The Roots of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte's Socialism notes that the future emperor of the French edited his political works through far-left publishers. Today the Bonapartist philosophy would fit into the space occupied by the Parti Socialiste, the Mouvement Démocrate, the Nouveau Centre and the left wing of the conservative Union pour un Mouvement Populaire, as these parties occupy the ideological space between parties advocating class struggle and race-based politics, both of which are anathema to Bonapartists, as contrary to the ideal of national unity and religious and ethnic tolerance. This is demonstrated by Napoleonic policy towards industrial disputes, one expression of which, as Frank Macklin writes, is that strikes were forbidden by Napoleon I, but in exchange the police sometimes prevented wages from being lowered too much, while another is the assimilation and protection of the Jews. The Marxist theory of left and right Bonapartism can be considered an illustration of what Macklin refers to as Napoleon I's appeal in equal measure to both the right and the left, and what Vincent Cronin describes as middle-of-the-way, or moderate, government. Napoleon III situated Bonapartism between the radicals and conservatives in Des Idées Napoléoniennes, published in 1839. He expounded on this point to explain that Bonapartism, as practiced by his uncle Napoleon the Great, was in the middle of two hostile parties, one of which looks only to the past, and the other only to the future, and combined the old forms of the one and the new principles of the other. Modern Bonapartism. In the modern era, the term Bonapartism has been used in a general sense to describe autocratic, highly centralized regimes dominated by the military. An official movement Bonapartiste survives in France, headed by Paul Napoleon Pierre Calland with an unknown number of members. Its official mission statement is as follows: to defend, make known and to spread the principles and values of Bonapartism. The movement is based on popular support for a policy of recovery combining the efforts of individuals, associations and state services. The movement defends the Bonapartist principles on which it is founded, and which govern its internal organization. It also defends the memory of Napoleon the Great, as well as those of Napoleon III and their sons, Napoleon II and Napoleon IV. It recognizes Napoleon IV as having reigned without governing, by virtue of the plebiscite of May 1870. The movement recognizes no emperor after 1879, because of the absence of a plebiscite.